Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, I'm pleased to stand once again in opposition to the Housing Accords and Special Housing Areas Bill. The Green Party and the Mana Party, in fact, were the only parties to vote against the bill at first reading, and we're proud to continue to oppose and pleased to see that other parties are now joining us in that opposition. And there are two key concerns at the heart of our opposition to this bill. The first is that it won't do anything to increase the supply of affordable housing. And that is a fairly fundamental point when that is the principal stated purpose of the bill, to increase the supply of affordable housing. So I'll go into some detail in my contribution shortly about exactly why this bill does nothing to increase the supply of affordable housing. The second key concern at the heart of our opposition to this bill is that we are profoundly uncomfortable with the provisions that override the autonomy of territorial authorities and limit consultation and appeal rights under the Resource Management Act. Although it's entirely consistent with this government's anti-democratic attitude on a number of fronts, but particularly its dismissive attitude towards local government, and indeed entirely consistent with its continued attack on environmental protections under the RMA, so we shouldn't be surprised. But we have serious concerns about those provisions, and they're the other key reason why we are opposing this legislation. So to take each of these concerns in turn, first of all, the question of whether the bill will actually do anything to improve housing affordability, and we've heard some contributions on this topic already from Phil Heatley and Jacinda Ardern. Now, there is no need that we do need legislation to improve housing affordability. Phil Twyford, my apologies, Mr Twyford. They both have a history of housing, but one perhaps understands the issues better than the other. There is no doubt, Mr Speaker, that we need legislation to improve the affordability of housing. When the average house price in Auckland is over $700,000, that's the average house price, and when it takes 70% of the average income in Auckland to service the mortgage on the lowest quartile house, we have a crisis, Mr Speaker, and we need legislation to do something about it. And it's not just in Auckland, because the national average house price is around $400,000, and that's unaffordable for many New Zealanders. And there's also a particular crisis in Christchurch as a result of a lack of supply of housing because of the quake. But it's a nationwide crisis, Mr Speaker. So we need to do something about it. And the Minister said in his first reading speech that this bill was, and I'm quoting here, a core part of the government's work to improve housing affordability, unquote. So you would imagine, therefore, that a core criteria of anything in the bill would perhaps be that it would actually do something to improve housing affordability. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And it's not even actually what the Minister wanted to do, because I had a look through the budget papers about the housing measures that were introduced in the budget, including the measures in this bill. And actually, up until quite recently before the budget, quite soon before the budget, the Minister wanted to establish an urban development agency, which perhaps would have been quite an interesting and novel way of looking at the issue of housing affordability. But obviously he couldn't get it across the line for some reason. So we got this bill patched together at the last minute instead, and that was very apparent, Mr Speaker, in the rushed way that the bill was brought to the House and in the substantive amendments that were required at Select Committee. And the essential problem with this bill is that it defines a problem as the supply of affordable housing, but it sets out a solution that is designed to address something different, and that is land supply. And the two are not the same thing. In fact, they're very different. And numerous submitters pointed out to the committee that, with the possible exception of Auckland, where the housing accord has already been negotiated, the regions of New Zealand that display high rates of housing unaffordability do not, in fact, have a problem with land supply. So the measures in this bill to create special housing areas and to fast-track consent processes will actually do nothing to address the issue of housing affordability in those other regions of New Zealand, because the problem in those places isn't land supply. So it's a land supply solution to a housing affordability problem, and it won't solve the problem. problem. And that was a consistent message that was given to the committee from both council submitters as well as property developers and individual submitters. And Peseta Sam Lotuinga spoke before, and he said land supply was the single biggest issue that we need to address when it comes to housing affordability. Well, in fact, the Property Council, who are property developers, Mr. Speaker, came in front of the committee and said, in their view, it was at most half the problem. And so this bill is not well designed to tackle the problem that we actually have. Now, secondly, it was widely acknowledged by submitters that even if the special housing areas created by this bill facilitated faster building and property development, the houses that were built as a result of that would be unlikely to be in the affordable category, because there's no requirement that a certain percentage of those houses are affordable. And the Minister said, oh yes there is, because it's in the Auckland Housing Accord. Well, it's only in the Auckland Housing Accord because the Auckland Council demanded it be there. The government wouldn't have put it there if it was up to them, and they haven't included provision in it for it in this legislation for other housing accords that might be developed in other parts of the country, Mr. Speaker. So it's only thanks to the temerity of the Auckland Council that we have that provision there. And again, even the Property Council acknowledged to the committee that they didn't expect the bill would actually result in the provision of any more affordable houses. And as my colleague Jacinda Ardern has said, the Minister was asked about this when he appeared before the committee for the estimates hearing for vote housing, and he basically acknowledged that was the case. And he said that it would be okay because wealthy people would move out of their smaller, more affordable houses and move into the larger new homes and leave those houses free for other people to move into. Trickle-down housing, as Ms Ardern has said. And that is a flawed assumption, Mr. Speaker, and it's a very indirect way to go about trying to tackle the problem of the lack of supply of affordable housing for a bill which supposedly is supposed to address that problem directly. What we should be debating in this House, Mr. Speaker, is much more direct legislation that tackles the problem of affordable housing head-on. And we have got some ideas in the Green Party about how we might do this. We, for example, would tackle the housing affordability crisis with a direct program of government-built homes, coupled with a progressive ownership scheme, or effectively a rent-to-buy scheme, so that families can move into those homes, pay a basic weekly rental to cover the cost of the investment to the government, and anything they pay in addition to that goes towards purchasing equity in that house. Now, that is a genuine way to both increase the supply of affordable housing and to help first-time buyers into homes without the need to qualify for a traditional bank mortgage and without the need for a deposit. That is a real solution to housing affordability, but it's not what we're debating in this bill. We would also do this in combination with a suite of other measures that tackle housing affordability, such as a comprehensive capital gains tax exempting the family home and restrictions on non-citizens or permanent residents from purchasing residential property. As well as that, Mr. Speaker, we'd address the problems in the rental market, which are significant, through a warrant of fitness for rental properties and more secure tenure for renters. But sadly, Mr. Speaker, that's not the legislation we're debating today. Finally, I want to address the issue of overriding local democracy, which is the second major concern we have with this bill. And there was overwhelming concern from submitters, including from territorial authorities, but not just from territorial authorities, from a number of other organisational and individual submitters as well, about the override provision that would allow the government to establish special housing areas, to appoint commissioners and to grant consents in those special housing areas without the cooperation of the relevant territorial authority. And we see this, Mr. Speaker, as an unacceptable curtailment of local democracy. It's entirely consistent with the dismissive attitude that this government takes to local democracy, quite literally dismissive in some cases, such as the ECAN councillors who were actually dismissed by the government. But it will be impossible, Mr. Speaker, for councils to negotiate housing accords in good faith with the government when they know that if they disagree with anything that the government puts on the table, or if they push back against any of the terms that the government is demanding, then the central government can just go over their heads and establish this special housing area in the way that they want to do it anyway. It puts councils at an incredible disadvantage in those negotiations, and it means that good faith negotiations essentially won't exist. Now, the disputes resolution clause that's been included by the committee and which was referred to by Peseta Sam Lotuinga earlier is actually optional. It has absolutely no teeth, and so it will do nothing to redress this incredible power imbalance. And as well as that, as I mentioned earlier, Mr. Speaker, relating to local democracy, all of the protections under the Resource Management Act, which we would expect to see applying in this situation, won't apply under this legislation, and that's a major curtailment of local democracy as well. So for those reasons, Mr. Speaker, we're very proud to stand in opposition to this bill.
Melissa Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a pleasure to rise and support and talk about the housing accords and